right, so today we're going to do a talk on cults. What is a cult? How would you know that you're in a cult? And some advice of how you would reach out to someone who you think is in one. So the first distinction I think you want to make when it comes to this is there's a difference between talking about cult and the occult. When we talk about the occult, we're talking about being supernatural, magical, mystical practices and phenomenon. Occult is, we're talking about witches, we're talking about paganism, we're talking about things along those lines. It's generally a series of practices when we're talking about those who want to engage in doing things with crystals, tarot card readings, witches, which is Wiccan. That's what we mean by occult. A cult, on the other hand, now there could be those who are part of a cult that are a cult. And so it's a small distinction to make, but just to clarify that to begin with, I think we need to kind of start there when we're getting into this talk. So then let's look at the other things. Why are we doing this? Well, essentially, the scripture tells us that we need to be on the lookout. It says in Matthew 24, 23 through 27, that at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is, out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is, in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So hopefully you're watching this video in some sense because you're seeing that there's a need for getting into this sort of thing. You see that you want to be able to reach out to others. My channel hopefully is equipping those who are trying to share the truths of Christianity with others and to bring them into a true relationship with God and giving them tools to do that more effectively. We can also read other passages in scripture that say this. 1 John 4, 1 through 3. Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into this world. This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, but every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world. And Matthew 7:15 through 16 says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. So then the question becomes, how do you define a cult? And maybe ask yourself, how would you do it when you think about it? I think Webster's dictionary doesn't really help us very much. It says a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious. Positive spin, way to look at it, is a group with less accepted views. Another way of looking at it is a group that has different views than the correct one, or a group of people that's usually following a dynamic leader and has beliefs or practices that are harmful to the people of the group. This starts to kind of get at, I think, what we generally think of when we talk about cults. One of the things that's interesting when we talk about the term cult is there are people now that are trying to just look at it, and you're seeing it with the last slide that I showed there, who just want to make cult seem like a positive thing. There's nothing really wrong with it. There's nothing really bad with it. I'm part of a cult. You're part of a cult. Every time that somebody has specific interests in a specific group or specific things, then you're in a cult. You're in the cult of Mac if you're an Apple user. But truly, when we're using that term in more general meaning, we obviously understand that we don't mean cult in this kind of positive spin sense. Cult has negative connotations to our culture. That's why when someone says you're in a cult, people object to it. They don't want to be seen as being part of a cult. So your definition of cult should have something that essentially shows us you have a negative connotation to what a cult is. Otherwise, you're trying to change the meaning of a word, and no longer are we using the English language in a way that's actually helping us express things to people, and that doesn't end up being all that helpful. So this is what I would propose. If you're trying to define what is a cult, I would use the acronym C.O.D.E. And we're going to define this a little bit more in depth, but just to start off, what we mean by C.O.D.E. is that they have censured beliefs, and this is looking on the inside. Their history and their beliefs are things that they're trying to keep from people who are even outside of the cult, but more importantly, we're looking with censured beliefs. You're looking at it and saying there's a certain level that they're not even telling people who are in the group what their history is or what their beliefs are. Secondly, ostracizing apostates. This is looking outward now. Is there ways in which the group is saying, don't talk with people outside of the group, or those who are part of the group and then left are no longer welcome to ever be and involved in any sort of way, whether it's socially or even in the ways that the cults usually get together, that they're ostracizing people who have left. Third is deified leadership. Is there some way in which the leadership is unquestioned, that it's not okay to start wondering, hey, I'm not sure if I believe that. Could you give me reasons why I should follow that, why I should believe that, why I should think that way? If you're not allowed to do those sort of things and it's seen as being rebellious just to even throw out the question, that's probably signs that you're in a cult. Lastly is what we would call excessive control, and that's starting to look at things and say, all right, there's things that really aren't that important to the functioning of this religious group or sect that is being extremely controlling over how you live your life. If it's telling you exactly how you need to dress, you can't have a beard. It's not just simply saying dress modestly and don't be showing a lot of your body, but it's saying you need to cover every inch and you need to have your hair in this style. Then you're probably entering into a point that you're probably looking at a cult in some form or another. All right, so let's talk about these a little bit more in depth. So the first of our C.O.D.E. acronym is Censured Beliefs. And we can see this with a number of different cults. We could talk about Mormonism in the sense that in early Mormonism, they didn't really teach people that Joseph Smith actually engaged in polygamy. Now, that's not something that the LDS Church keeps secret much anymore, but it is something that was kept secret for a very long time. Furthermore, when we look at other groups, we can see something like the LDS Church that would even keep the history of the church quiet. They would actually cut out. When you look at the Church of Scientology, the whole point of Scientology is supposedly to go clear. You saw my dog in the background there. Hey, Sherpa, you want to say hi? And with going clear in Scientology, you are basically going to try to rid your reactive mind of past experiences that you had that is making it so you can't actually perform the way that you're supposed to today. In order to do that, you go through these different tests, you go through these different kind of questionings, and these are supposed to cure you of your reactive mind. But these things with the history of what they actually believe, do they believe that there's this other planet and this other species that actually put you here as Thetans and things like that? You don't learn about that when you first sign up for Scientology. You learn about that as you move up the ranks within the group. Most cults will end up having kind of this group within it that are the elites, the people that know more of what's going on. Those people have all the information. It's not given to everyone. If you have a group that is not letting everyone know up front what's going on, even when you ask questions, then that's probably a sign that you're in a cult. Now, that's different than Christianity, where we may look at it and say, hey, I'm not going to start off the bat with why I think it's important you don't believe this or do believe that. If somebody asks questions about that, I'm more than willing to have that conversation. I'm not trying to hide it from you. But there's no reason that you need to know these more advanced theologies and different things early on. And so we start you off with the basics. We start you off with what's most important and central. And then we get to the nuanced and more advanced theology and things like that. That's not hiding it from you. We're just taking it one step at a time. That's different than what a cult does. Now we could talk about a few more examples. The Church of Christian Science keeps it secret that Mary Baker Eddy changed the origin story of her connection with Phineas Quimby, which was someone that they believe basically helped her to kind of develop her idea that you can just pray over and be healed of things. Scientology, like I said earlier, they hide their belief in Thetan, but they don't hide their belief in being a Thetan, which is their way of saying spirit, but they do hide the idea of Xenu, which is the other planet that everything's kind of coming from. LDS temple practices are considered so sacred that you're not supposed to talk about those with outsiders. Now, it could be true that there's things that are religiously sacred and therefore you shouldn't talk about it with others, but we also know that Mormons early on were not aware that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. Another thing is, even within church history very recently, the translating of the Book of Mormon was talked about and illustrated as him actually looking at the Book of Mormon and translating it, where we know that the tradition now is he actually looked in a hat and there was a rock inside the hat that helped him do the translation process. That was a little weird, but that's how the history actually goes with how Mormonism believes that Joseph Smith translated the plates, and that was kept secret really until the last 20 years or so, or it was at least not promoted very much because the visual illustrations that people made that the church even endorsed didn't show that that's the way he did it. The World Mission Society Church of God doesn't promote the idea that Enzang Hong, who is the founder of the cult, and if you're not familiar with the World Mission Society Church of God, they believe that Jesus Christ already came back as a Korean man in about the 1960s, and now it's run by someone else who is Enzang Hong's wife, who is now supposed to be the Holy Spirit, and because Enzang Hong died, and they don't promote the idea because they reject the Trinity, that Enzang Hong actually believed or did not believe in Mother of God to begin with. And Mother of God is who they now say that his wife is. Another cult, and I'm going to mess up the name, Sung Chung-ji, when attempting to recruit Christians, will say they believe in the Trinity, but they do not. So point number 2 in our code is ostracizing apostates or people outside of the group, and this happens in several ways. First of all, some cults will engage in what we call shunning, where when somebody leaves the group, the society or the cult themselves will say, don't interact with them, don't talk with them, not just with church stuff, but hey, even if they are your relative, you shouldn't talk with them. Don't engage with them. Block them on social media. Move away from them if necessary. Everything you can do to cut off ties. Other things along this line that groups do, other things that cults may do is cut you off from any outside influences. They don't want you checking the news. They don't want you going on Google. They don't want you getting on the internet. They don't want you looking at encyclopedias that are not made by them or resources that are not made by them. Here are some other things that we see some cults do that you might want to be on the lookout for. Jehovah's Witnesses particularly are known for shunning, where they will not let you interact with people who have left the church. Families are divided. A mother leaves the Jehovah's Witnesses and her family is told not to interact with them. A child leaves the Jehovah's Witnesses, and even when they're still a child, they're still underage, they're told, do not interact with them, kick that child out of your home. And then these children are left trying to find somewhere else to live because their own family won't take care of them. Those sort of things are things that are not okay. The fundamentalist Latter-day Saint Church was known for when they kind of started to do their own schooling, and they started to have their own little library for their community for all the teaching that the children were learning. They would literally take encyclopedias, go through them, and they cut out the articles that talked about evolution. They cut out the articles that talked about anything that they disagreed with. And so that was the only way that people could learn, was what the cult was telling them. In fact, there was articles that were taken out of the encyclopedias on sex, so that then when these children were then given in child marriages, then they had no idea what to expect the night of the wedding because they had never learned a shred of anything about sex. And so it was a total shock to them when all of a sudden they went from, oh, I'm going to get married, to, oh, marriage involves this whole sexual thing, especially for those who were children getting married to older men. And that's some of the horrendous things that happen in some cults like that. Number 3 in our code is Deified Leadership. And you see this very clearly with some of the cult leaders that are more common and famous. So this is Shoko Ansahara. He was the leader of a cult in Japan that actually ended up doing a terrorist attack, attacking the subways in Japan. And he has this one picture of him that supposedly he's meditating and levitating. I think it's pretty clear to see from the picture that he probably just jumped while he was in cross-legged stance, and then they took the photo while he was in the air. But he's trying to promote this idea that he's God, or that he has some sort of supernatural power that nobody else had. This other leader is the leader of realism. And realism, this is Claude Verheeren, and he promoted the idea that he was actually talking with aliens. The whole idea of aliens that are green people that have circular UFOs is probably mostly due to his supposed visions that he had of these aliens that he then would call Jehovah's, that were giving him divine inspiration and understanding of who God was and what they needed to do next and how they needed to clone themselves in order to be able to kind of be projected up into the world that the aliens were creating for them later, and so they could live forever. So with that comes the thing is, are you allowed to question the leadership? Now, it's one thing. There always does, I think, probably become a spot with most religions where they say you just need to trust the Lord in this, whether it's more of the practical of you're going through a hard time or something like that, or there's things that we just don't have a full understanding of, or we can't understand this little piece of theology. But I think a group that is not cultish will be okay with you asking questions and will say, I'm going to give you the best answer that I can. But when you have a cult that's really deified the leadership, then anytime that you start doing that, they're going to ostracize you. That's when they're going to start saying you're an apostate, you've questioned too much here, and you just need to leave altogether. That's not healthy. That's not how religion should work. And it's definitely not how Christianity should work. When you see that John doubts or Thomas doubts, Jesus doesn't respond saying you need to leave or you need to just trust more, but he actually gives evidence and clarity to the questions that they're promoting. With that, also with deifying leadership is, do they seem too perfect? And this is just a way of photoshopping, in a sense, your leadership. If only things that you ever hear about the leadership is how great they are, then chances are they're only telling you the good things that they've done, and they're never telling you the things that they've done bad. If you have a group that the leader is willing to admit, hey, I've messed up, I've done things wrong, which hopefully your pastor is one of those people, then you're going to see that, hey, I'm on the right track. I'm not way off, and this isn't some sort of cult, because even the leadership is admitting that sometimes they get things wrong. Another thing to look at is the leader just simply full of themselves? Does it seem like they're really focused on themselves? With realism, that same guy I showed you earlier, he actually wanted to be a race car driver. He wanted to be an actor. He was trying to get famous in every way that he could, and it seems like this is the way he was able to do that more than anything else. Are the leaders also somebody that's inaccessible? Now, of course, when you look at, let's say a mega church, you have a church that's got 5,000 people and you're asking if you can get a one-on-one with the pastor and you don't have anything really pressing, well, chances are you're probably not going to meet with them one-on-one because they have so many other things that they're trying to do and so many other people that they're talking with. But when you have it where it's a small group, or you have it that even those who are higher up seem to don't have any opportunity to ever talk with those who are in leadership, then you have reason to question if this is really a good group or it's a cult. Here's some more examples that we see that within Mormonism, there's a teaching that was spread for a while that said basically when the prophet is spoken, all the thinking has been done. So you're not allowed to question. Once the prophet said anything, you just need to believe it, and that's it. End of story. L. Ron Hubbard with Scientology said he's held up by his followers as an intellectual titan. His research and his life experiences are used to give his followers credibility. With the World Mission Society of Church of God, Ansung Hung and his mistress, Zhang Jia, are the Christ and the Mother of God, respectively. So then you, of course, are not allowed to follow it. Happy Science, which is, believe it or not, like an anime cult. The founder of that is believed to be El Cantar, the super space Buddha, and the father of Jesus. So of course, if that's the case, you can't question him at all. Now, of course, this brings up, how do we make that different? We say that Jesus is God. How is that different than these cults saying that this person can't be questioned? Well, it's one thing if you're looking at it and you're saying, hey, this within our religious belief, this is the God figure, and someone who's saying this is the person speaking for the God figure. And that's what makes things quite a bit different in that realm. The last thing in our code, C.O.D.E, is the E is excessive control over lives. Now, it's one thing for a religion to look at it and say, hey, I think men and women need to dress modestly and kind of follow that rule to your best knowledge. But it ends up being a whole nother level when we talk about FLDS, for instance, that we're not only saying, hey, women need to dress modestly, but they need to wear this kind of like Little House on the Prairie type dress up, which is not what the modern dress was at the time. And there's plenty of ways to still say just as modest in dress, yet dress more modest, dress more modernly. The hairstyles were things that were determined directly by the prophet, like certain braided hairstyles. And some of these hairstyles were like ones that would take like an hour, 2 hours to just get your hair into this style. He liked that style. So he told all the women, that's how you have to do it. Those sort of things, you're throwing excessive control over people. If you're saying, hey, we think you need to quit your job for whatever reason, if it's not more of, hey, we think you'll find a job that's better pay, we're advising you to, we just think it's a wise thing to do that. You're controlling who they date or arranging marriages of who they do and don't marry. Those sort of things, that's a cult move. They shouldn't have that sort of authority over what you're deciding to do in those areas. So what are the certain ways that cults can end up really growing, or how does one start a cult? There's a really good documentary on Netflix if you're interested called How to Become a Cult Leader. I think it has some really insightful things. Here are a few things that I pulled from it and some other resources that I checked out. So the first thing that I would look out for is it creating an us versus them culture? So one of the ways that you can do that is starting making terms for those who are in the cult and those who aren't in the cult. Terms like saying Gentiles or antis or darkies, Cain and Abel, to say that those who are part of Cain and those who are part of Abel, to distinguish the good from the bad. And there's an extent that happens in every religion. Christianity is going to look at it and say those who are following Jesus, and those who aren't. And there's destinations decided for those. But if you're hyper focused on that becomes an issue. Another way of creating this us versus them mentality is to create a unique language. So this is what we call code switching. Experts in cults will call this code switching. So groups with Heaven's Gate, for instance, would talk about your earth suits, saying that you live in these bodies, but you're not there forever. They would call it the fabric room for the laundry room. They would call it the chemistry lab for the kitchen, different things like that, where it starts to just make it where a normal person should be able to understand what you're talking about. But because you've assigned completely new terms for things that have generally some pretty known and acceptable terms, people can't understand what the heck you're talking about anymore. And so now you've created this us versus them mentality because, hey, you have this secret knowledge that nobody else has, where really all you've done is redefine the terms in order to create a feeling that there's a difference between what you know and what others know. Another thing in that is can be like thought terminating cliches, like saying you just need to have more faith. You just need to pray about it. Anything that through the discussion, suddenly it's, well, we can't talk about this anymore because what you just said ends all intellectual discourse. when a Mormon says, well, you just don't know because you haven't read the Book of Mormon. Now we can't really have a discussion if you haven't read the Book of Mormon. You've tried to cease the conversation from going any further by that comment, and it's not really allowing for meaningful dialogue to keep happening. Another thing cult leaders will end up doing is kind of creating an inner circle. So here are the people that know everything and anything and everything that's going on. They have more power, they have more authority. They're going to want to bolster what you're promoting, what you're throwing out there, because they're gaining from it, and nobody else knows those sort of things. So you've kind of created this inner circle. Another thing that cult leaders will do is they'll end up kind of basically getting the group to rip each other apart. So if I can learn as the cult leader the things that you don't like or that anger you about someone else, I can now use that to pit you against that person. If I know the worst things that you've ever done, this is where confession can sometimes be detrimental, because now if I know your deepest, darkest secrets as your cult leader, I can use that as blackmail, essentially. And that's what one thing with the Buddha-filled cult that he did phenomenally well. He actually would have these one-on-one sessions with his members of his cult, and would basically ask them to rat out the worst things that other people in the cult have been doing, so that then he could use that against them and also get them to not keep communicating with each other. And that allowed him to continue to have the power, because everyone else is fighting against one another, and he's the only one that is kind of moving forward. Everyone seems to be on board with what he's saying, and there's no division with their loyalty to him, and complete division with their loyalty to one another. Another thing cult leaders end up doing is really testing their followers. Marilyn Manson, you see this first picture written on a wall on a house that he had his followers go into. It says, "Death to pigs." And basically what he did is what he called helter-skelter. He would tell his followers to go into a house and just break things. They didn't kill anyone. They didn't try to even interact with anyone. They broke things and they left. They didn't steal anything. And what he's doing there is he's testing how far they're willing to go before they're going to say no to what I'm saying. And so he does this a few times, and he's thinking, okay, well, if they're willing to do that much for me, maybe now they're willing to actually commit murder. And his whole idea is he was promoting this idea that he was saying that there was going to be a race war, and at the end of this race war, him and his people will kind of bunker down, and then they'll come out, and the only people that'll be surviving after this race war are black people. But for some reason, after this race war happens and all the black people die, and Marilyn Manson and his followers come back, they'll actually want to have him be the leader. And so he's actually trying to instate or try to make a race war happen with these helter-skelter experiments by saying death to pigs and then attacking white homes so that people would think that black people are committing these crimes against white people and start a race war. As he does this, and then he sees that they're willing to go that far, eventually he goes and says, I want you now not to just go into this house and destroy things. I want you to kill some people. Heaven's Gate, similarly, the leaders of that cult, this guy in the top right, is actually still someone who really still feels that the Heaven's Gate cult is true, despite the fact that so many of them died, committed suicide years ago, and were claiming that they were going to end up in a UFO and taken away by aliens. Well, as they started to progress as a cult, they started to really embrace everyone has to look the same. Everyone had almost the exact same haircut, men and women, dressed the exact same, men and women. And then eventually saying, hey, your sexual bodies is something that isn't going to be part of you when you're taking up into space. And so we want some of you to emasculate yourselves in order to kind of get your bodies more ready and prepare for what that's going to be like before you get into space and you're taken up. So this guy, along with a few others, actually castrated themselves. They had somebody on the staff or somebody in the cult that was somewhat of a medical expert that did it. And, you know, when you've gotten people that are willing to castrate yourselves, then chances are you're willing to commit suicide as well. With Jonestown, we saw similarly, they all moved to Jonestown from the United States. They go there, and then he does these tests and experiments where he's telling them, drink the Kool-Aid, and eventually the Kool-Aid is actually spiked to kill people. So you work your way up, testing, demanding more of the members and seeing if they'll actually do it or not. You'll actually maybe even do things of sleep deprivation, keeping them awake in different ways. That was something that definitely happened at Jonestown as well, in order to get them just to not think well, which is just a typical tactic to get anybody to do anything that you want. Which really does just bring up the subject of brainwashing. And brainwashing is something that cult experts today, it's just not really a term that is used by cult experts or scientists in any way whatsoever. Sometimes we just forget and don't realize how susceptible we can be, especially in times of vulnerability, which is a lot of times when cults come along and try to grab people, that how susceptible we are to hearing what we want or wanting to have something to live for or being a part of a group that can end up slowly doing this whole brainwashing process. And so the idea of brainwashing isn't necessarily a term that I would use when it comes to cults. I think it's just being honest that people are susceptible to accepting these sort of things. And even ourselves, we don't realize how much we might be willing to give into something like that. Another thing that a cult leader should do or will do is make themselves indispensable. You become your group's only hope. You make yourself the voice of God. And at that point, why would anybody question you? You seem to be the source of this inspired knowledge that nobody else has. Of course, somebody's going to follow you in that. So the more that you can promote this idea that you are God, or you are the voice of God, or you have this special connection with God that nobody else does, then it makes it really hard for people to ever move out. Another thing that along that line is, if you're making yourself indispensable, if you offer them your own little Garden of Eden, then people aren't going to want to leave. We see that cults, again, do this. And here are a couple examples within that. When you look at the FLDS, this is a compound that they had right there in the center that had this temple that was supposed to be the new Garden of Eden. Jonestown, when they moved down there, that's what that was supposed to be. Buddha Field, he makes this what is now a performance hall that he did his own little dances. He used to be a ballerina himself, made these productions, forced them to be performers themselves in order to do the productions with them, made this really cool home for that. With realism, they claimed that eventually the aliens are going to come back and they're going to establish this kind of ambassador center of the aliens right here on Earth. And we're going to be assigned to do that. He made designs of it, but he never did it, because once he did that, then, of course, the aliens are supposed to come back as he prophesied, and that would give away that he didn't actually have anything to offer. Another thing to do, or that cults will do, is figure out ways to expand their territory. This is why we see that some cults focus on how do we connect and get people connected with the cult that are famous. People like Tom Cruise with Scientology, Joaquin Phoenix was a part of Children of God. Kelly Clarkson was believed to be part of the Nexium cult at one point. And then I'm forgetting the name of this actress that was part of the Superman series. She even tried to recruit Emma Watson. Those sort of things are things that, hey, if I can get somebody famous to promote it, then of course more people are going to accept it. And, which goes right along with publicity control. Sun Myung Moon was probably the best at this, shaking hands with the president. He did this one thing called the Ambassador of Peacemaker Awards, Ambassador of Peace Awards. And he did it through all of these things that made it really hard to trace it back to the Moonies as an organization. And it's inviting religious leaders from all over the world to say, hey, we're giving awards away for ways that religious groups have tried to bring peace along in the world. And lo and behold, they were going to crown someone as the best ambassadors for peace in the world. And lo and behold, somehow Sun Myung Moon and his wife are the ones elected for it. That's promoting how good they are. Johnstown, the leader there, was seen as someone that actually really helped for bringing about civil rights movement. And actually early on, that's probably pretty accurate. Shoko Asahara, we see that he was with the Dalai Lama. Anytime you can have a picture with the Dalai Lama, people see credibility with that. But he also was able to promote himself even as action figures that were sold in stores, which then made him probably the most popular pop icon as a cult leader as anybody in all of history, and as well as things that he showed up on Japanese television. Maybe that's just because of the weird television shows that Japan often has, and he was able to grab onto that in a way that nobody else was. Who knows? But he was a master at it. So what can you learn from all of this? I think it's important that we don't just criticize cults. I think we all still want to see, is there something that we can learn from it, even if it's learning what not to do? One of the first things I think we can look at is always be willing to have dialogue with people. Try to avoid those statements that end conversation. I don't want it when someone just asks me a question to say, let me just tell you to pray about it. You need to just read your Bible more. I'm trying to avoid those sort of thought-ending questions, thought-ending statements in order to continue the conversation. Even if it's just saying, I don't know, can I get back to you later to continue that conversation because you don't know what to say now? That's a much better way to approach it than what these cults end up doing. Allow people to think for themselves. Oftentimes I look at it, I tell my students the reason why I'm willing to bring in groups from other religions and have them teach you is because I'm not concerned that they're going to convince you. I've taught you how to think well, and if you think well, you're going to see the truths of Christianity come out, and you're going to be able to expose the bad ideas that are promoted by someone. Most of all, I hope we remember not to dehumanize people that are in cults. It's really easy for us to make fun of or talk about how weird the ideas are that some of these cults were, but people have genuinely bought into these. And we genuinely want to look at it and realize these people, we're not fighting against them. We're fighting against the principalities, the ideas, and the spiritual authorities that have set themselves up against Christ. And so we want to bring someone into Christianity, into the truth. And so not to ostracize them in that way, but to figure out how can I come alongside them and teach them the truth. Some sobering statistics when thinking about this is survivors in the United States of cults experience PTSD at rates of 61.4% men and 71.3% in women. This is in stark contrast to the average rate, which is only 6.8%. And the average rate age for someone who joins a cult is 25. So if you're post-college, chances are this is the most likely time one of your friends or someone you know could end up in this. What are you doing to be able to combat that? What are you doing to see if someone's in it to bring them out of it? So here are my suggestions. Some ways that I would say this is helpful to help someone get out is get a group of people who love and care for them and to kind of start doing a process of intervention and realize when you do this, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You're not probably going to have one meeting with them and all of a sudden they're going to see why what they believe is totally bunk. They're going to need time and time again seeing that you do love them, you do care about them, you do want the best for them before they come out of it. Help them to think and learn by themselves. Allow them to think, hey, I'm not telling you you have to believe this. I want you to think this through. I'm throwing these out there. I'm throwing these out there as ways that maybe you should question what you're learning from the person that you're following right now. But I'm not going to tell you you have to believe this. Think for yourself. Think about this yourself. Don't say that they're in a cult. That will end the conversation. That's a thought-ending statement in their mind. Let them choose to leave the cult. Don't force them to do it. Let them choose to do it. Otherwise, they're going to feel like they're just leaving one place that they have no choice for another place that they have no choice. And most of all, I would say consult a cult expert. If you're really sure that your friend or someone you love is in a cult, then reach out to someone who really knows more about this. I'm happy to be a resource to you. I don't know if I would consider myself a cult expert. I've spent a lot of time preparing this. And to be honest, is it not as fresh as when I first presented it to one of our Ratio Christi chapters at the beginning of last semester. So there's some things that I don't know as well as I did before, but I think there's a lot that I could have to offer. So if I can be a resource, please don't hesitate to reach out. With that, go use this, use it to share with other people, use it to help people from getting into cults, use it to help people to get out of cults.